Imagine vast and endless plains, rivers flowing through dense forests. In the far north, lands covered with snow, and in the south, wide open steppes. The territory that today is called Russia was for thousands of years a vast region where different peoples lived, migrated, and moved onward to other lands. In the earliest times, these lands were not divided into clear states. People lived in small tribes along the rivers, surviving through hunting, fishing, and simple farming. Forests provided them with wood, while rivers offered fish and natural trade routes. Over time, Slavic tribes began to appear across the East European plain. Gradually, they settled along rivers and built small villages. These tribes were not yet a single people. Each had its own territory, customs, and leaders. However, they were united by common features, similar languages, similar traditions, and a way of life closely connected to nature. Life in those days moved very slowly. Days began with sunrise and ended with darkness. Winters were long and cold, while summers were short but fertile. Trade routes and external influences. The territory of Eastern Europe lay along very important trade routes. Large rivers flowing from north to south connected the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea, creating convenient passages for merchants. Through these routes, Scandinavian traders, known as the Varangians, began to arrive in these lands. They were brave seafarers who traveled long distances and traded from their ships. Over time, the Varangians did not limit themselves only to trade. In some cities, they also took political power. During this period, a new state gradually began to emerge on the historical stage. The state of Kievan Rus. Around the 9th century, the Eastern Slavic tribes united and founded the state known in history as Kievan Rus, with the city of Kiev as its center. At that time, Kiev became a very important trade center. Ships arrived along the rivers, merchants from many peoples met in the markets, and goods brought from distant lands were sold there. The state gradually grew stronger. Princes, the rulers, established systems for collecting taxes, organizing armies, and defending cities. Life during this period was simple but orderly. Farmers cultivated the land. Craftsmen produced items from wood, iron, and leather, while merchants set out on long journeys along the rivers. Changes in religion and culture. At the end of the 10th century, an important event occurred. The ruler of Kiev, Vladimir, decided to adopt a single religion in order to strengthen the state. As a result, in 988, Christianity was adopted. This decision led not only to religious but also to cultural changes. Churches were built, writing spread more widely, and monasteries where books were copied began to appear. Cities gradually expanded, and trade and crafts developed. Kievan Rus became one of the important states of its era. The fragmentation of the state. However, over time, the central authority weakened. Rivalry among princes intensified, and the state split into smaller principalities. Each region began to govern itself almost independently. This left the lands vulnerable to external threats. At the beginning of the 13th century, a new force appeared from the east, the Mongol armies. They were highly mobile, disciplined, and powerful. The Mongols attacked city after city, conquering many principalities. Cities were destroyed, trade routes were disrupted, and for a long time the territories remained under Mongol rule. This period later became known in history as the Mongol-Tartar yoke. The rise of a new center. During the period of Mongol domination, one of the smaller principalities gradually grew stronger, the Principality of Moscow. At first, Moscow was a modest town, but its rulers pursued cautious policies and steadily annexed neighboring lands. Trade routes began to pass through Moscow, the army strengthened, and the city gradually became a political center. Thus, a new era, the era of Moscow, was approaching on the stage of history. A small town of Moscow, located among dense forests, was gradually growing. At first, it was merely a simple fortress and trading post, but over time its importance steadily increased. During the period of Mongol rule, many principalities were forced to pay tribute to them. The princes of Moscow skillfully took advantage of this situation. By maintaining relatively peaceful relations with the Mongol rulers, they gained greater trust than many other principalities. As a result, Moscow gradually accumulated power, wealth, and political influence. The rise of Moscow. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the Principality of Moscow began to annex many of the surrounding lands. This process was not rapid. It unfolded slowly over many years. Sometimes territories were added through wars, and at other times through marriages, alliances, and agreements. The city itself continued to grow. Stronger structures replaced wooden walls, trade expanded in the markets, and the number of craftsmen increased. Merchants arriving by river filled Moscow's markets with a variety of goods. During this period, everyday life for ordinary people remained simple. Farmers cultivated the land and raised livestock. Craftsmen produced iron weapons, wooden items, and tools for daily use. Life moved slowly, following the rhythm of the seasons. Toward independence. By the end of the 15th century, an important event occurred. The Principality of Moscow gradually began freeing itself from Mongol domination. This process did not happen suddenly. It was the result of long political and military struggles. During the reign of Ivan III, Moscow began to present itself as an independent center. Continuing the policy of uniting other principalities, he gathered vast territories under a single authority. From this time onward, Moscow increasingly came to be viewed as the new center. The city's walls were strengthened, the Kremlin was expanded, and Moscow became the heart of the state. The beginning of the Tsardom. In the 16th century, Ivan IV, known in history as Ivan the Terrible, came to the throne. He became one of the first rulers to proclaim himself Tsar, symbolizing the further centralization of state power. During the reign of Ivan IV, the territory of the state expanded. Armies marched eastward, conquering new lands. At the same time, efforts were made to establish strict internal order within the country. This was a complex period. On one hand, the state was expanding and growing stronger. On the other, domestic policy was often carried out through harsh and sometimes ruthless measures. Nevertheless, Moscow continued to strengthen as the central power. Toward new horizons. By the end of the 16th century, Russia had begun to occupy a vast territory. Trade routes expanded, new cities appeared, and paths toward Siberia were opened. This marked the beginning of the formation of an even greater empire in the future. Amid long winter nights, vast forests, and distant rivers, this state was gradually approaching a new chapter in its history. Ahead lay further trials, turbulent times, and eventually the era of a great empire. A state spread across vast territories, with cities surrounded by distant forests and endless steppes. Yet despite its impressive size, this state was approaching a difficult period from within. At the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, a harsh era in Russian history began, known as the Time of Troubles. During these years, struggles for the throne, internal conflicts, and economic difficulties intensified. In some regions, famine also occurred. Trade slowed down, and people began to live with growing concern about the future. Various individuals appeared claiming the throne. At times, one ruler would reign only briefly before being replaced by another, creating instability in state governance. During these years, external powers also attempted to take advantage of the situation. Wars broke out along the borders, and some cities changed hands multiple times. This period became a severe test for the people of Russia. The beginning of the Romanov dynasty. Finally, in 1613, in order to stabilize the country, a new ruling house, the Romanov dynasty, was placed on the throne. The young Mikhail Romanov was elected Tsar. This decision brought hope for peace and stability to the country. With the rise of the new dynasty, order gradually began to return. Trade routes revived, cities were rebuilt, and agriculture in the countryside slowly recovered. After many years of turmoil, people once again began to feel the return of a more peaceful life. The rule of the Romanos would become the central period of Russian history for the next 3 centuries. Expansion to the east. During this period, the territory of Russia continued to expand. Travelers, merchants, and Cossacks began moving eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Vast forests, great rivers, and endless lands were gradually explored. The region of Siberia was slowly incorporated into Russia. Rich in natural resources, these lands expanded trade and economic opportunities. New forts and towns were established, and distant territories gradually became connected with the central government. Long winter nights, snowy roads, and great distances did not make these journeys easy. Nevertheless, people continued moving forward in search of new opportunities. The gradual strengthening of the state. Throughout the 17th century, state administration became more organized. Central authority strengthened, the tax system improved, and the military was reinforced. The number of cities increased, while crafts and trade slowly developed. For ordinary people, however, life remained closely tied to the land. Farmers worked in the fields, craftsmen produced goods in small workshops, and merchants set out on long journeys. With the changing seasons, the rhythm of life also shifted. On the eve of a new era. By the end of the 17th century, Russia stood on the threshold of new transformations. The country possessed vast territories, yet several European states were far ahead in technology, navigation, and industry. In the coming years, a new ruler would appear, one who would lead the country onto the path of sweeping reforms, transform the appearance of its cities, and accelerate the process of turning Russia into a great empire. This ruler would become known in history as Peter I, or Peter the Great. At the end of the 17th century, a state possessing vast territories was gradually entering a new era. This country, known for its ancient cities, wide forests, and long trade routes, still lived in many ways according to old traditions. At this time, a new ruler appeared on the stage of history. Peter I, later known as Peter the Great. From a young age, he was fascinated by ships, sea voyages, and new technologies. In his view, for the state to become strong, it needed a modern army, developed trade, and access to sea routes. The era of reforms. During Peter's reign, many changes began in the country. The military system was reorganized, new ships were built, and greater attention was given to the development of industry and crafts. Foreign specialists were invited, and new technologies were studied. These changes did not come easily. Some people wished to preserve the old traditions, while others felt that a new era was beginning. Nevertheless, the state gradually started moving along a new path. A new capital, St. Petersburg. One of Peter's most famous decisions was the construction of a new city. Built on the shores of the Baltic Sea, this city later became known as St. Petersburg. It became not only the new capital, but also a gateway for trade and cultural connections with Europe. Constructing the city in a marshy area was extremely difficult. Thousands of workers labored for a long time. As a result, a new city with wide streets, palaces, and a seaport emerged. St. Petersburg gradually became the political and cultural center of the state. The beginning of the imperial era. By the beginning of the 18th century, Russia began to be recognized as a powerful military and political state. Near the end of Peter's reign, the country was officially proclaimed an empire. This marked a new stage in its history, the beginning of the imperial era. Trade expanded, new cities appeared, and maritime connections strengthened. The country gradually began to occupy an important place in European politics. After Peter the Great, the empire continued to develop. During the reigns of various rulers, new territories were added, palaces and cities were built, and science and culture began to flourish. Throughout the 18th century, Russia became a large and influential empire. However, governing vast territories, uniting many peoples within one state, and solving economic challenges remained complex tasks. At the same time, new ideas slowly began to spread within the empire. Ideas about education, science, and changes in society. Toward a new century. By the end of the 18th century, Russia had become an empire with vast lands, a strong army, and an important role in international politics. Yet the future was preparing new trials and transformations. Ahead lay the age of industry, social changes, and the complex political events of the 19th century. The 19th century is beginning. A vast empire stretches from the distant north to the warm southern regions, from Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Wide territories, diverse peoples, and many cities exist within a single state. This period became both a time of growth and a time of trials for Russia. The era of the Napoleonic Wars. At the beginning of the 19th century, major political changes were taking place across Europe. The French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was waging wars against many states, attempting to reshape the map of Europe. In 1812, Napoleon's armies invaded Russian territory. This event became one of the most important turning points in the empire's history. The armies marched long distances and advanced toward the capital. However, long distances, the cold climate, and logistical difficulties changed the course of the war. As winter approached, movement became increasingly difficult. As a result, Napoleon's forces were forced to retreat. This event held great significance in Russian history and further strengthened the country's position in European politics. Social problems within society. Although the empire appeared strong externally after the war, various internal problems remained. The majority of the population consisted of peasants, many of whom lived under the control of landowners. Social inequality was significant, gradually strengthening calls for change within society. Cities slowly developed, new factories appeared, and trade expanded. However, economic changes did not progress at the same pace in all regions. The era of reforms. In the middle of the 19th century, important reforms were carried out. One of the most significant was the emancipation of peasants from personal dependence. This decision led to major changes in the structure of society. Reforms also brought changes to the judicial system, education, and local administration. These processes unfolded slowly and sometimes with difficulty, but they opened the path for the gradual modernization of society. The beginning of the Industrial Age. By the end of the 19th century, industrial development accelerated. Railways were built, the number of factories increased, and major cities expanded further. New jobs appeared, and people began moving from villages to cities. These changes brought not only new opportunities, but also new social challenges. The number of workers grew, urban life accelerated, and new political and social ideas began to emerge within society. The end of the century. By the end of the 19th century, Russia was an empire with vast territories and a developing industrial economy. Yet the rapidly changing world was preparing new trials. Ahead lay the 20th century, a period of wars, revolutions, and events that would transform the entire system. At the beginning of the 20th century, the vast empire still occupied enormous territories, yet gradual changes were quietly strengthening within society. Cities were growing, industry was developing, and new ideas were spreading among the people. This period was approaching one of the most important turning points in Russian history. World War I. In 1914, a great war began in Europe. Many states joined the conflict, and Russia was among the countries that entered the war. The war lasted for many years and had a major impact on the country's economy and the daily lives of its population. Large numbers of people were sent to the front, and shortages of food and resources began to be felt in the cities. As hardships increased, public dissatisfaction grew stronger. The events of 1917. The year 1917 became a crucial year in Russian history. First, in February, political changes took place, and the imperial system that had ruled for many years came to an end. A provisional government was established. However, the country's problems were not quickly resolved. In the autumn of the same year, another major political change occurred. power passed into the hands of other political forces, and the process of creating a new state system began. The period of civil war. In the following years, a civil war broke out in the country. The struggle among various political forces and groups lasted for several years. This period became a severe trial for both the economy and everyday life. Nevertheless, after the war ended, the new political system gradually consolidated, and the state slowly began to stabilize. The formation of the Soviet Union. In the early 1920s, a new state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was established. This state united various republics under a single political structure. In the following years, large-scale programs were carried out to develop industry, build new factories, and transform the economic system. New cities appeared, railways expanded, and greater attention was also given to education and science. The beginning of a new era. By the 1930s, the country had changed significantly. Agriculture, industry, and systems of state administration were reorganized. Although these transformations were complex processes, the country was entering a new era. However, history was preparing new trials once again. Soon the world would be drawn into another great war, and this war would have a profound impact on the history of Russia and the entire world. By the late 1930s, the world was once again entering a period of major political tension. Disagreements among various countries intensified, and the international situation became increasingly complex. In 1941, the Soviet Union was drawn into the turmoil of World War II. The war became one of the most difficult trials in the country's history. Many cities turned into battlefields, and millions of people worked both at the front and on the home front. Despite long and exhausting battles, harsh climatic conditions, and enormous losses, the war eventually came to an end. In 1945, victory was declared, and the war concluded. Post-war reconstruction. After the war, the country faced an enormous task, rebuilding destroyed cities, restoring industry, and stabilizing economic life. Many factories were rebuilt, new housing was constructed, and the transportation system was restored. People gradually began returning to peaceful lives. This process took many years, but eventually the country once again became one of the strong industrial states. The Cold War era. After the war, the world became divided into two major political systems. This period became known in history as the Cold War. It was not a direct, large-scale war, but rather a time of political rivalry, technological competition, and military preparedness. During these years, science and technology developed rapidly. Space exploration began. New industrial sectors emerged, and great attention was given to education and scientific research. Cities expanded, new residential districts were built, and transportation systems developed. Everyday life for people also gradually changed. The 1970s, 1980s. Over time, new economic and political challenges began to appear. Growth in some sectors slowed, and the need to modernize the economic system became increasingly evident. In the 1980s, discussions began about initiating reforms in state governance. New political decisions were aimed at transforming the economic system and modernizing society. These changes gradually initiated a broader process of renewal across the entire system. On the eve of a major turning point. By the late 1980s, the world once again stood on the brink of major transformations. Political systems were changing, and in many countries a new era was beginning. The Soviet Union was not left aside from these changes. In the coming years, history would witness another significant turning point. The large state would dissolve, and in its place, new independent states would emerge. By the late 1980s, the large state system that had existed for many decades was gradually changing. Economic difficulties, political reforms, and new ideas led to the beginning of major transformations within society. The reforms launched in the 1980s were aimed at modernizing the economic system, increasing openness in society, and transforming state governance. At first, these processes were carried out cautiously, but over time they had a profound impact on the entire system. 1991, the beginning of a new era. In 1991, a historic event took place. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. In its place, several independent states emerged. The Russian Federation began its development under a new political system. This period was economically and socially complex. The transition to a market economy, the creation of new laws, and the restructuring of the economic system required major changes. In some years, economic difficulties were strongly felt, but gradually a new system began to shape. The 2000s. By the 2000s, efforts were made to stabilize state governance and the economy. Trade in energy resources, along with the development of industry and infrastructure, contributed to economic growth. New roads, buildings, and modern technologies increasingly entered everyday life. The modern era. Today, Russia is a country with vast territory, encompassing various climate zones, numerous cities, and many different peoples. Having passed through many trials, transformations, and historical eras, this land continues to develop along its path. Distant forests, wide steppes, northern icy regions, and great cities, all of these are part of a history shaped over thousands of years. Thus, the story that began with the ancient Slavic tribes gradually passed through the eras of principalities, the Tsardom, the years of a vast empire, revolutions, a new state system, and finally the modern age. Across the centuries, many generations came and went, cities were built, roads were opened, and history moved forward slowly yet steadily. And now, as the night quietly settles, it seems as if the long pages of history are gently closing. A breeze moves across the wide forests. Distant rivers flow calmly along their paths, and history waits for the next dawn.